In the social hierarchy of peace that I have described, more love flows down than flows up. The father loves his son more than the son loves him. The ruler speaks to the one ruled from a position that is qualitatively and not just quantitatively higher. He condescends. The human hierarchy, therefore, images and mediates the transcendence of God through these smaller transcendences of friendship, and all authority among men becomes an imaging of and participation in the authority of God. So first, just thank you, and thank you to David and Pater Edmund for those talks this morning. I thought they were remarkable, and the learning and sophistication that was on display is humbling. It's very humbling for me to come on after them, and so I'm honored to be a part of this discussion. Okay, so I hope everybody's ready to bring it down a couple notches. All right, so in my book, Before Church and State, I attempted to describe the world of 13th century France as it emerged from the source material, from letters, court cases, laws, decrees, and liturgical texts. What I discovered in these sources was a world in which the peace of communities was not the product of formal structures of rule, of what we would normally consider political powers or governments. Rather, peace emerged within these communities as what produced and held them in being. Peace was a word used to describe the act of a just society. What I saw was a world without a sovereign lawmaking or law enforcing power. What I saw was a kingdom of extreme diversity and local variation that was united in unbelievably complex and ununiform ways through vast webs of personal relationships. The king served this order. When conflict erupted, he intervened to try and restore peace. He investigated how the people had been living peacefully, tried to figure out what had gone wrong, and then worked to correct the injustice and so restore their particular way of life. Sovereignty had no place here. Formal law was rare and of really relatively little importance, and bureaucracies and other administrative apparatuses simply did not exist. We ourselves live in a time when fictions about sovereign power can no longer be maintained. Indeed, postmodern theorists such as Foucault are far, far more helpful, I think, in understanding contemporary politics than our more traditional constitutional or legal theories, which have become mostly tedious and rather naive moralizing within rigid categories such as public and private, economics and government, legal and moral, and so on, which are just no longer capable of describing what we actually see. When we look around us, we do not see the formal unitary power structures. We do not see the formal unitary power structures that flow from some source of power that such categories rely upon. Rather, as Foucault described, we see complex webs of overlapping power economies. These structures form innumerable hierarchies that flow through all aspects of human life. They are rarely juridical in a positivist sense. They are constituted and maintained not through some central mind ordering it all towards some end, but through every person wielding power and obeying power, submitting in one place while making a move for domination in another, obeying law here while undermining it there, undermining legitimacy here while most slavishly submitting to the power of social norms there. Sovereignty of the old-fashioned variety is nowhere to be found, as men seek to build their own power through placating and manipulating, through diverting, exaggerating, or suppressing economies of power that emerge from the bottom, from the side, from the top, from every which way. And yet the reality of power is more obvious than ever. Power we see everywhere. Power holds it all together somehow. Thinkers such as Hobbes and Foucault saw all this. They knew that positive juridical structures were not the foundations, but the window dressings of real experienced power. They explained how these societies of power held together through positing a fundamental conflict of all against all as the stable principle of society's dynamic existence. Our proper reaction to this postmodern world is not to retreat to defunct modern theories of positive governmental power, but to power through postmodernism, like Augustine powering through paganism, showing how the truth that these approaches see is more completely and more compellingly grasped by Catholicism. In the current paper, I attempt to counter the postmodern priority of war by giving a theoretical explanation of the priority of peace as I believed it existed in the Middle Ages, using the works of St. Thomas Aquinas as my primary source. This theory will accommodate neither an authoritarian nor a libertarian, or maybe I should say totalitarian, understanding of politics, because it will not accommodate the notion that society is constructed from without. There is neither the unitary state nor the self-sufficient individual. From the beginning, Catholics often make a mistake with regards to the relationship between law and virtue. For Thomas, virtue is the end of politics, and so of law. Law habituates those who it rules into virtue. Now, there are two ways to understand this. First, we can treat law as a fixed thing, let's say a dictate of reason for the common good, and then conclude that virtue is the sort of thing that can be formed through such commands. This approach is what Father Pinker's took to task in his seminal book, The Sources of Christian Ethics, as supposing that moral virtue consists primarily in habitual obedience to extrinsic law. The second way is to flip the first way on its head. We treat virtue formation first and adapt our understanding of law to it. In this way, we can ask, if law forms virtue and virtue is formed in certain ways, what therefore must we understand about law? We might rephrase this by asking, what form does politics take in light of its end, which is virtue formation? What must law be if it leads to virtue? In this way, we start with the end and then discuss the means, not the other way around. This is a better method, I think. This is the method adopted by Aristotle within his Nicomachean Ethics and his Politics, and followed by St. Thomas in the second part of the Summa, when he moves from the treatise on habits to his treatise on law, and then back to virtue through his treatise on grace. Where I want to begin is with the relationship between a father and a son. I begin here because it is the foundational relationship with regards to the end of politics, which is virtue formation. As Thomas writes, quote, although the benefaction of a king, absolutely speaking, is greatest insofar as it extends to all the people, nevertheless, the benefaction of a father is greater in relation to one person. A father is the cause of the son's three greatest goods. First, by generation, he is the cause of the son's existence. Second, by upbringing of his rearing. Third, of his instruction. These three goods are attributed not only to fathers in regard to their sons, but also to the ancestors, namely the grandfathers and great-grandfathers in regard to their grandsons and great-grandsons. The relationship between father and son is where politics most simply and directly happens. This initial move is sometimes resisted. The reason, I think, is a failure to remember, at least the way I understand it, that the common good exists only as realized by actual particular people in their concrete relationships. Both Thomas and Aristotle understand fatherhood to be foundational for politics because it is archetypical of the types of relationships where the end of politics, virtue, and so happiness is both built and experienced. How does a father lead his son into virtue? The most obvious answer might be something like this. The father sets up a system of rewards and punishments, inducing the son to act in a moral way. We can think of these as little laws. Through repetition of these acts of the virtues, through obeying the laws, the son becomes habituated to moral acts and so acquires the virtues. But this just doesn't work. It doesn't work because of what virtues are. Virtues are formed through the repetition of moral acts. In order for the moral virtues to be formed, the appetite must be led by right reason repeatedly. In this way, through the agency of right reason, the indeterminate potency of the powers of the soul are increasingly activated into their perfection as powers governed by reason. In these virtuous forms, the powers respond to reason in a way similar to how determinate powers are ordered directly by reason, for instance, how I can move my hand with a thought. Only the exercise of right reason in the actor himself can form virtue. This is so because a virtue is not quite the same as a disposition, or what we tend to call habits. Dispositions begin to form as soon as any actions are undertaken. Every act disposes the relevant powers towards its object, activating their indeterminate potency in a certain direction. If I live in a certain culture where we eat haggis a lot, I suppose, as hard as it might be to believe, that I will come to desire it. This is a disposition. But objects of acts of right reason are variable given the circumstances. We sometimes conclude that it is appropriate to eat haggis, and we sometimes, more often no doubt, don't. The repetition of acts directed by right reason, which is to say the repetition of properly human acts, creates a sort of master disposition, which is the disposition to desire whatever objects are proposed by right reason. Such dispositions over time become stabilized in forms that are like nature, and these are virtues. What this means is that virtues govern what we normally call habits or dispositions. Once we are virtuous, we can decide easily not to eat haggis today, regardless of how badly we might want to, inexplicably. We become more perfectly human, more perfectly rational and free, through the formation of ever deeper virtues. One conclusion to immediately draw is that fear does not create virtue. Obeying a command out of fear is not moral action. This is so because precisely to the extent that the act is motivated by fear, to that very extent it is not voluntary, and neither is its object the good as understood by the commander, but is rather some other good that the one being commanded fears he will lose. To the very extent that it is motivated by fear, to that exact extent, it is not properly human act at all. If someone obeys an extrinsic command out of fear, even if it is rational and for the common good as understood by the commander, the command is not a principle of proper human action, which is rational, voluntary, and aimed at the common good. Rather, it is a principle of action only as an aspect of the circumstances. This is why fear as fear cannot lead to virtue. So, for example, if a man wants to maximize his physical pleasure and minimize his pain, and he obeys a ruler merely because if he doesn't do as commanded, he will suffer physical pain, the ruler's command is not a principle of his action as human action. The law of pleasure is the law actually being followed. The ruler's mandate, on the other hand, is simply an obstacle that must be navigated. Such commands, met with disorder in the intellect and will, met with vice, do not change vice to virtue. In fact, they are far more likely, I think, to make vice deeper and more sophisticated as it develops to navigate the social setting in which the actor finds himself in order to maximize his disordered desire satisfaction. Tyranny, rule through fear, leads to vice, not virtue. This is a situation easily observed within the father-son relationship, when, for example, a father is overly aggressive in cracking down on a rebellious adolescent, leading him into deeper rebellion. In order to lead the son into virtue, the father must truly understand and love his son. Through this knowledge and love, the father can apply severity and leniency in the right places, can offer relative goods to the son in precisely the places where the son is looking for them in accordance with right reason, and so can coax his son deeper into virtue. In order for the son to build virtue, he must repeat actually internally moral acts. According to Thomas, law is an external principle of human action, and human action is rational and voluntary. Only human action leads to virtue. What this means is that for a command to be a law properly speaking, the receiver of the law must receive it into his practical reasoning as if it was his own conclusion. He must receive the right reason of another as if it were his own. This means that it is not transferred in a univocal manner through power and submission, but in an analogical manner through authority and obedience. The reason of the ruler is participated in within the mode of the ruled. This is what obedience is, and it is only possible through the love of rational creatures. Through obedience, the son is capable of participating in the prudence of the father, a participation that can only find a place to begin in the son's own properly ordered reason and will. This is how power becomes law, which leads to virtue. To lead another into virtue, therefore, requires great commitment, time, and attention. As Father Pinker stated, quote, "Education in virtue is a difficult and complicated task. It calls for the exercise of authority and profound respect for those to be educated to go hand in hand. It demands a great deal of intelligence, sensitivity, and a strong will. It must be careful to avoid equally the abuse of authority which bullies the personality, suffocates it, or causes it to revolt, and the naive liberality which neglects to give the personality the assistance it requires. It calls for a deliberate balance for which only an intelligent love for the person whom one is educating can find the correct formula. If in this task, the father has a great advantage over other would-be rulers, because not only does he live with the son, but Thomas tells us the son has a natural inclination to love and respect him, to obey him. As Thomas wrote, the benefits of good laws come more through fathers than kings, quote, by reason of relationship and benefits, because of which children love their parents and are readily obedient out of natural affection. So then, although the royal decree is more powerful by way of fear, nevertheless, the paternal precept is more powerful by way of love, a way that is more efficacious with people not totally depraved, end quote. If the father works in and through these natural inclinations, as well as those of the natural law, he can lead the son to multiply moral actions, actions that flow from the son's own right reason and good intentions, and so lead him deeper into virtue, which is deeper into his perfection as himself, and not as a mere external repetition of his father. This sort of intimacy is essential because, to repeat, virtue is not formed through the rote repetition of externally identical actions. This leads to a sort of automatization, which actually evacuates moral content from action. Rather, virtue is built through performing many actions that vary widely in their externals exactly because they are based upon the repetition of an internal action, the repetition of acts of a properly correlated intellect and will. So one becomes temperate through eating more of one thing in a particular circumstance and less of it in another circumstance. External fixed rules cannot capture this dynamic. Only an intimate, caring father who knows the son in his complex combination of natural dispositions, acquired dispositions, habits, virtues, and vices, and who knows the circumstances of his actions, and who is obeyed by the son through his coordinated intellect and will, only to the extent that a father is such a man can he lead his son along the narrow paths that lead into perfection. In this way, through love, the father does not impose his own form onto the son, but rather makes paths of participation for the son as he is, and so the son comes to be further formed as himself, imaging the father within his own mode, within the development of his own personality, and not against it. This does not mean that the externals of action are unimportant. Virtue is precisely the unity of the internal and the external in goodness. This is why we can say with Thomas that virtue makes a man good. So the father's training of the son into virtue includes always a training into the external paths that this virtue takes in circumstances in which they together find themselves. Habituation in these paths, the formation of dispositions, such as liking haggis, for example, happens simultaneous to and very much helps in the formation of virtue. Such dispositions are closely related to what Thomas and Aristotle call arts, which are skills, for example, bricklaying, and that we learn in order to accomplish certain tasks, but that must be ordered by virtue in order for the performance of those skills to be good. The point here, though, is that the external rules of behavior to form dispositions in arts must be laid down by the father. You learn bricklaying by being shown directly how to do it and then practicing. These skills are not independent of the virtues, however. The virtues will be actually lived through the deployment of skilled action, and the desire to learn the skills and the willingness to endure the discipline of learning them are what largely make up the multiplicity of interior moral acts that eventually form virtue. The bricklaying father teaches the son the virtue of fortitude through the long days of stacking bricks properly. His father teaches him the virtue of honesty through teaching him how to bid a job. These skills facilitate both the son's learning of virtue and his ability to live it in an integral life of excellence. What we need to see, though, is that the moral law always and from the very beginning is instantiated in a social determination or specification. We learn what it means to honor our mother and father by learning how we, in fact, honor our mother and father. This is why Aristotle and Thomas put so much emphasis on concrete experience and so age. Here, then, we find the importance of external rules, of guidelines, of human laws in the everyday sense of the term. General rules for proper action in the majority of cases must be laid down by the father. In following these rules willingly, the son both learns skills and develops the virtues. In following these rules willingly, I already read that. Okay. As his sons and virtues develop, they started with the same words. As his skills and virtues develop, however, his acts are steadily less governed by the rules and more governed by himself. Increasingly, he decides how to best deploy his dispositions and skills in order to best achieve the desired end as the scope of his freedom is expanded. He's being moved from being a boy to being a man, from the imperfect to the perfect, from participation in reason to reason itself. But this man that he becomes is not a generic man, formed in some abstract virtue. Rather, he is formed as an ever more perfect son of a certain father, an ever more perfect bricklayer, an ever more perfect citizen of a particular city. His virtue, his excellence as himself, integrally, not in the official sense of the word, but integrally includes all these complexities, all these involvements. He does not have prudence, for example. He has the prudence of a Jones, of a bricklayer, of a citizen of Steubenville. This question of citizenship is particularly important for the question at hand. One might be tempted to accept everything that I've just said while asserting that all this has little to do with politics. Politics, after all, would seem to be how these little father-son dynamics are integrated into the larger whole. The father might teach his son bricklaying or how to chew with his mouth closed because he is the ruler of the family, and these things happen within private life. But citizenship would seem to concern the political society, and so be taught by the ruler of that society, the prince. But this, I venture, is mostly mistaken. The virtue that governs political life is justice. Justice directs all the moral virtues towards their proper end, which is the common good. But this does not mean that the moral virtues are developed first through a certain regime of private training in the pursuit of private goods, and then are later assembled through justice insofar as this private life is integrated into the pursuit of some additional good, the common good. Rather, moral private life is ordered by justice from the beginning. The moral virtues are developed in the first instance as integrated into a whole through justice. Justice is what unites them in a person, making him a good person. So the prudence of the bricklayer is the prudence of a bricklayer as ordered to the common good. The notion of vocation already includes this understanding. One is called to serve others in one's vocation. The training then that the father gives his son is a training in justice, is a training into his place in the ordering of society as a whole. Bricklayers, after all, are only bricklayers as workers on a building. The bricklayer is not first formed and then later extrinsically united into society's larger project. Rather, the whole is present in the good bricklayer, in the mode of the bricklayer from the beginning. He finds himself always already in an actual society. He renders each in society his due from his position within that society relative to each. As Thomas states, quote, "Only those who render mutual assistance to one another in living well form a genuine part of an assembled multitude," end quote. This is what his vocation essentially is. Man is a microcosm, we are used to saying this, but he is no less a micropolis. The common good, then, is lived in his real relationships. As Thomas writes, quote, "In the worthiest state, no one is a good citizen who is not a good man." The common good in act, the peace of a society, simply is the network of particular just relationships. The tranquility of order, as St. Augustine calls this peace, simply is the tranquility of these relationships through their overlapping vocational justices. This order itself is instantiated in each relationship in the particular mode of that relationship, and so makes the unity of society possible from within through its infinitely variable analogical repetition up and down and across the social order. The Father is understood as a father by the Son in an analogical way to which he is understood as a father by himself and understood as a father by the Prince. And yet his vocation as father places him natively in each of these analogical repetitions of the tranquility of order. It is precisely this situation that is his complex integration into the actual peace of the society, its real tranquility of order. His vocational participation in this peace is his living of justice, the ordering of all the virtues toward the common good. His human potentiality for the common good is activated as this particular mode of fatherly, bricklayerly, Steubenvillianly prudence and justice. It is in this that he finds freedom and happiness in his vocation, a vocation that aims down to his Son, up to his Prince, and across to his friend in a single operation, a single living of justice, a single living of the virtues for the common good, which simply is him. The happiness of the common good, of the polity, is in this way had at the smallest level, in a sort of cascading instantiation of peace, or it just doesn't exist outside of the abstraction of theorists. The happiness of a just society is the happiness of real persons in their real relationships. And so the guidance of men into happiness, into virtue, is the guidance of particular men by other particular men who know each other's names, archetypically the Father and the Son. The relationship between father and son is archetypical, not exhaustive, of politics. All political relationships are analogously related to this clearest and simplest instantiation of virtue formation. The defining characteristic of the father-son relationship are inequality and love, which translates to what we might call care. At this point, an objection might be raised. Friendship seems to be an essential relational type in the polity, and yet friendship is characterized by equality. It's sort of true. Aquinas directly states that all friendship is modeled on the father-son relationship. Perfect friendship is the enjoyment of each other in each other's virtue. But as I have just attempted to describe, virtue is formed exactly as an instantiation of justice in the mode of the individual person. Friends are just differently. Friends have different vocations within the polity, and so different skills ordered in different ways through their particular versions of the virtues. A friend is not a repetition of the self. He is another self, a different self, an analogical self. This is the only reason why he is not incredibly boring. Friends who are peers are equally unequal. What this means is that all the dynamics of the father-son relationship are present in the friend-friend relationship, only in the mode of friendship rather than that of parent and child. Friends shift back and forth, trading the positions of authority and obedience, of teacher and learner, of ruler and ruled, leading each other deeper into ever more perfect virtues, which include analogically the other, producing unity and peace. Aquinas, following Aristotle, identifies conversation as the greatest joy and characteristic act of friendship. Friends live together and talk to each other. But conversation is nothing else than this shifting of authority and obedience. I listen obediently to my friend, believing him, trusting him, like a son his father. Then I offer a gift back. I tell my friend something I know that I believe will make him better, and he listens to me obediently, believing me. And this conversation happens only within the context of a shared world of ordered things and activities, a peace, a tranquility of order. Friendship presupposes, Thomas tells us, a place of communication. We instantiate this peace into each other through our back and forth shaping of each other into our image, into more subtle and so more complete justice. The very possibility of language, it would seem to me, flows from such a reality of analogical participations in the peace, even while the use of language and conversation is what builds this peace, as friends become more united in their shared project, even as they become more perfectly themselves. As Aristotle remarks in chapter 1 of the Politics, quote, "Speech indicates what is useful or harmful, so also what is just or unjust. For strictly speaking, it belongs to human beings alone, in contrast with other animals, to perceive good and evil, just and unjust, and the like. And communicating these perceptions produces households and political communities. Aquinas, in his commentary on these lines, simply confirms Aristotle's understanding, emphasizing that households and political communities are produced by conversation concerning just and unjust, right and wrong, conversations that, of course, can only happen within a grouping of real friends that already exists. Talking about who they are and who they ought to be in reference to each other is how men move together deeper into the peace, the tranquility of order that flows out of mutual virtue, which is the living of justice. One learns the art of the language of one's city as one learns his place in that order. The language is a determination of the indeterminate, a certain way of articulating the truth of the cosmic order through the social order. And language works exactly through the massively complicated overlapping networks of analogical instantiations of this already complicated tranquility of order. As Thomas explains, quote, "Everything is uncertain when there is a departure from justice. Nobody will be able firmly to state this thing is such and such when it depends upon the will of another, not to say of his caprice." Learning to speak about the just and the unjust, the true and the false, the good and the bad, is learning how to be a citizen, because participation in this dialogue is how the city is built and maintained. The city is built and maintained as a just city if that dialogue is a dialogue of truth and love, of authority and obedience, if it is a dialogue between men virtuous in their vocations, that is to say, the conversation of friends. Friendship, then, is necessary for happiness, because happiness in this world is this common movement deeper into virtue. We need friends to be happy not only so that we can receive from them, but also so that we can give to them. The just society is constituted by overlapping networks of friends, in which every man is either a real friend or a potential friend to every other. Every man is, in Thomas's sense, a neighbor to every other man. This is possible because every human encounter bears the marks of the archetypical father-son relationship. Every human encounter is marked by inequality, and, Thomas tells us, every man has a natural inclination to love his fellow man. Every human encounter, even the casual head nods of two men passing on the sidewalk, bears analogically and in its own mode and the form of father and son. And every human encounter is between men who are themselves embedded in overlapping networks of friends. As Thomas explains, when I love my friend, I love all his friends in and through him because they are a real part of who he, in fact, is. It is out of all of these communications, all of these instances of various degrees of care, rooted in various degrees of intimacy, that the tranquility of order is deepened as every man's particular instantiation of that order, every man's justice. Every man's justice comes to include more perfectly his understanding of who the other is and what he ought to do for him. The just polity, then, is made up of true citizens in the Aristotelian sense. Every person in turn both rules and is ruled. He does so within his particular vocation and his particular network of relations, which is, in practice, the only way to rule and to be ruled. This is the nature of friendship, and it is the reason why friendships between unequal persons are not just possible, but are the archetype of all friendship. Let's return to the father and son, because it is hard here to see how the son rules the father. Give me a second here. The father is not only physically stronger than the son, he has more knowledge and more virtue. He can see deeper into the son than the son can see into himself, and he understands the son's situation in the world more profoundly than can the son. Consider a father who casually covers the table's sharp corner with his hand as his toddler unknowingly stumbles by. What is more, the son is clearly not capable of understanding his father as his father understands him. When the father gives the son instruction, the son is not capable of understanding fully. He cannot see the Father's reasons as the Father sees them. If he could, he wouldn't need the Father, but merely a mechanism of data transfer. Aquinas goes so far as to say that the Son does not love the Father as much as the Father loves him. Such relationships are profoundly asymmetrical. This power differential renders the Father's care a real gift because only he knows its true content. The Son cannot even give gratitude that is proportionate to this care because it does not fully perceive or understand it. The Son is loved from above. More love descends through the hierarchy than ascends. Through the reality of love, the Father is truly donating out of his power to his Son. Because he loves his Son, the Father elevates his Son's interests into his own. The Father gives more than he gets. He puts his life at the service of his Son's happiness, and through this, through the Father's own power, his Son becomes, in a sense, more powerful than him. This is how the Father lives justice in relation to his Son. As Aquinas explains, justice produces proportionate equality. In his justice, the Father can receive the clearly inadequate return gift of the Son as indeed wholly adequate, exactly because the Father loves the Son as his Son, and not as his peer or his superior or as someone else's son. We might say that he makes up the difference between his Son and himself from within the surplus of his virtue, and so renders an equality between himself and his child. The Father understands the Son from within his justice, his instantiation of the tranquility of order, which includes intrinsically an understanding of the inferiority of his Son. The higher, then, can receive the inadequate return of the lower as exactly adequate, or even as exceeding justice, as generous. This is the equality that the virtue of justice makes possible. But this means that the Son emerges as having care for his Father, though in a properly sonly manner. The Son's return is a return of a true friend, and if he uses it well, he leads his Father into virtue through it. What father hasn't beamed with joy when his child brings him one of his little drawings? Or been motivated when a child unexpectedly says thank you with sincerity and without prompting? Or been gently rebuked when a child innocently asks him for the third or fourth time when he might have time to push the tire swing? These are the types of returns that justly come to benefactors. And it is through these returns, these instances of care, which flow out of his obedience, that the Son becomes the ruler and the Father the ruled. The back and forth of all friendships are analogs of this dynamic. As Thomas explains, the friendship that a father has for his son, quote, is nearest to the love of a man for himself, from which all friendship is derived. With reason, then, paternal friendship is considered to be the starting point, end quote. Likewise, quote, in all such friendships between dissimilar persons, like father and son, king and subject, and so on, friendship is equated and preserved by something which is analogous or proportionate to each, end quote. In real relations, there are no true peers. And so in a regime of justice, everybody is both ruler and ruled in real relation to everyone else through proportionality. Quote, a just action, Thomas asserts, a just action is a mean between doing what is unjust and suffering what is unjust. Proportionality, of course, assumes some shared hierarchy of values. This is the tranquility of order itself, participated in analogously and asymmetrically in the modes of the actors insofar as they are just. However, obviously, this proportionate equality operates within a real, stable hierarchy of people. The tranquility of order is the tranquility of a hierarchical order. St. Thomas often evokes the image of an architect in order to explicate how a ruler uses authority to direct those below him toward the common good. This image is, I think, often misunderstood. The architect's art is higher than, for example, the bricklayer's. This is clear. But that does not mean that the craftsman is merely an instrument in the architect's project, as if he were a tool or robot. This would be straight tyranny. Rather, he is ordered into the architect's project as a craftsman, with the emphasis on the man, which is to say, as citizen in his own right. We might say that such craftsmen learn their art within the architect's art and not prior to it. The Father does not teach the Son what a brick is without teaching him what he ought to do with it, without teaching him what it is for and how it interacts with the other things and other men working on those things. To be trained as a craftsman is to be trained in a project in a particular city. The art which is in the abstract neutral towards ends is in reality never neutral towards ends. One city's bricklayer is not the same as another's. The architect, the ruler then, works within a network of men and things already related to each other. But in this medium, he is himself a true craftsman, like the bricklayer in his art. Every free man is an architect, selecting means toward the fulfillment of the end of the common good from within his mode, within his vocation, which includes, as we have seen, the vocation of everyone else through justice. The bricklayer, then, chooses the plan of the architect as a part of the means of his own architectonic pursuit of the common good as a bricklayer. He does this because he ought to, because it is just, and the bricklayer's perception and living of justice is his vocation. This is his obedience. Every man is obedient up, we might say, and architectonic down, obedient as ruled and architectonic as ruler. But even this misses something of the truth because, in fact, his obedience falls within his architectonic vocation, within his beneficence, we might even say. Here we can better understand Thomas's assertion that only a rational creature can be given a law. Law is this relationship of the higher to the lower within a regime of justice that they share. A just regime is made up of free men who, as architects, obediently adopt the reason of their superiors as means toward the achievement of their own project, which is the common good, as instantiated in their vocation. This is just another way of reasserting that he is a true citizen of the polity, who both rules and is ruled, one who knows how to work for his superiors exactly because he knows how to command his inferiors. We see again how the father-son relationship lies at the foundation of politics. The architect's art is aimed at the completion of a whole, as the bricklayer's is aimed at the completion of a whole, but from within a different mode of being just. The architect works through the vocations of other men. The craftsman works with matter to elevate it into the tranquility of order that is this ordering of men. The craftsman finds the world of matter already ordered within a relational hierarchy. In his first encounter, clay has a relationship to sun and water. The craftsman finds the world of matter already at peace, and he works in that peace, elevating it into the life of men. As I have asserted, the craftsman learns his trade, and so learns about clay, sun, and water, already elevated into the social order. For the bricklayer, clay was never anything other than that which bricks are made out of, and bricks are never anything other than that which walls are made of, and so on. The bricklayer, then, isn't just a source of generic walls for the architect to assemble. Rather, the bricklayer's idea, the exemplar of his wall, includes within it its place in the whole as he understands it. The bricklayer builds this wall because he loves the common project in which he is employed and wants to provide an example for his son, as both ruler and ruled. All of this is in the form of the wall that he creatively executes through his art. Similarly, the architect finds men already ordered, already living in friendships that are not merely extrinsic relations, but which flow out of and further form the reality of their unique personalities. He finds men already living together in peace. His vocation, then, is to elevate their work into a greater plan, a higher project. If he works against the form of his matter, of the men, he will fail. In the same sort of way that a father must work always within the existing goodness of his son in order to deepen his virtue, an architect must work always within the existing peace of his city. The building that is the result of this work is built out of men and built through their relationships as they really are with each other and with the world. The craftsman works obediently within the plan of the architect. He is obedient up, as is a son, and architectonic down, as a father, as a benefactor. He not only controls his own crews, his sons and hired hands, leading them to virtue, but he controls his own work, his own art, all of it aimed through justice to the common good. A society of such men is a polity, a just order of free men. The architect speaks his plans into the community of craftsmen who understand it from within themselves and mediate it down in humility through their own rule into the various vocations that constitute a society of friends at work. Law, then, as a word for these asymmetrical relationships of justice, is in a free society architectonic all the way down, and every free man is, in his own way, both a legislator and subject to the law. If it were otherwise, the craftsmen would be mere instruments. They would be slaves in relationships of power and submission, and not free men in relationships of authority and obedience, through which every man is both ruler and ruled, both father and son, a true citizen. It is perhaps here that we can better understand how law and freedom are not at odds. The freedom of each man is real and unequivocal. It is not the freedom of submission, the freedom of merely conforming and habituating one's will to the will of another, no matter how rational that will may be. Such so-called freedom is a sleight of hand type of freedom, the type Hobbes is capable of understanding. Rather, in the just society, individual freedom is not conformed to the common good, it is what constitutes the common good. Every man works freely in his vocations, selecting means towards ends within and not against the peace of the whole, the tranquility of order which is his world. He is at home in the peace, at peace in the peace, and so free in the peace. Increases in his virtue increases agency as it increases society's perfection. The horizon of his social action expands as his virtue deepens. Rather than imagining law as leading to freedom, I would rather assert that living in the peace, in the law, is what it means to be free, to be at home in the world. To be out of the peace is to be at once a sinner, a criminal, a tyrant, and a slave. The vocation of the prince rests at the top of the city. His end is the deepening of the virtue of men, whose friendships bring the polity into existence. The prince's vocation is to perfect everyone else's vocation. He is an architect that builds with stones that are real free men. As each man lives freely his vocation in justice, he reaches up to his superiors for the plans, for the determinations of reason that he needs, a reaching that extends all the way up to the prince. These plans, which work as relative universals, then cascade down through networks of analogical instantiation, growing more particular at each stage through the prudence of men in different vocations, and terminating in the profound diversity of individuals who image the whole in the unique mode of their life, of their personalities. As Thomas writes, quote, the teaching on matters of morals, even in their general aspects, is uncertain and variable. But still more uncertainty is found when we come down to the solution of particular cases. This study does not fall under either art or tradition because the causes of individual actions are infinitely diversified. Hence, judgment of particular cases is left to the prudence of each individual, end quote. This could lead us back to a discussion of how language functions, but we'll leave that for another time. As St. Thomas describes God's creation of the cosmos, he states, quote, he, God, produced many and diverse creatures, that what was wanting to one in the representation of the divine goodness might be supplied by another. For goodness, which in God is simple and uniform, in creatures is manifold and divided, and hence the whole universe together participates in the divine goodness more perfectly and represents it better than any single creature. And then again, he says, a thing approaches the more perfectly to God's likeness, according as it is like him in more things. Now in God is goodness, and the outpouring of that goodness into other things. Therefore, the creature approaches more perfectly to God's likeness if it is not only good, but can also act for the goodness of other things, than if it were merely good in itself. Now a creature would be unable to act for the goodness of another creature unless in creatures were plurality and inequality, because the agent is distinct from and more noble than the patient. Therefore, it was necessary that there be also different species of things and consequently different degrees in things. We see then that the tranquility of cosmic order is not a static order, but a dynamic movement of potency to act, a never-ending perfecting as everything interacts with everything else, a dynamic that avoids paradox through its openness upwards to the divine and God's continuous action throughout the whole. The cosmos images God in its dynamic hierarchical diversity, and man images him even more perfectly through his hierarchical diversity that through its work elevates the cosmic order into itself and so into its regime of love that opens up to, even as it is sustained by, the divine. The prince does not create this microcosm ex nihilo. He does not create the piece that holds it together. He does not extrinsically link independent components into a new mechanism that he then operates for the common good. Rather, his vocation is the deepening of the piece. As Thomas explains, peace is the health of a city, and the prince is like a doctor. Virtue is qualitative, and the end of the prince's vocation is the deepening of the virtue of the city, of the men of his city. As we have seen, virtue is built through friendship, and so the priest's vocation is to purify friendship, extend friendship, to transition rules into realized relationships of mutual love. The hierarchy that orders the city needs to be made ever more rooted in unequal friendships, needs to be made ever more personal, ever less extrinsic, and ever more internalized in father-son style relationships, and so ever more diverse in the particularization of its increasing virtue. As the Father guides the Son deeper into virtue through the Son's obedience, through his good inclinations, his particular instantiation of the virtues, so the prince serves as a father to the city. This is nothing other than the care of souls. And as Thomas tells us, law must be made by one who, quote, who has the care of the community, or has care of the community, I should say, end quote. The care of the prince is yet another instance of the type of authoritative care that runs up and down the social order. Such care is not an office that is held. Care is not de jure. One is not granted or delegated care of the community, except incidentally. Neither is it merely de facto power in a Schmittian understanding of sovereignty. Care is not a synonym for power. Care, love, is rather the existential precondition for giving law as true law. And as we have seen, this care permeates the society of free men from top to bottom. It is the very heart of the father-son relationship, the archetype of all just human relationships. The prince, if he is a just prince, has such care for the whole. We identify him through his de facto authority, not his de facto power. I hope at this point, the political form that corresponds to the notion that law causes virtue is beginning to become clear. It is the form of a peace built out of friendships of hierarchical inequality that result in profound diversity within a true unity. Every level of this hierarchy receives more general or universal law from above and specifies it freely in ever more particular and so diverse forms to those below, until finally the individual man internalizes the whole in himself as a unique, just citizen. This is the form of just human law, of the specification of the natural law, which is the human participation in the eternal law. It is not a univocal, positivist legal order centered on some ruler, but an order of analogical participation where the law is lived as justice itself in the lives of real people at the scale of direct interaction. And the infinitely complex and variable world of particular action is brought together in a unity without homogeneity. This is, I think, the form that the church calls subsidiarity, and which we can now see is not a policy recommendation, but an anthropology. The prince authoritatively speaks his dictates of reason, his laws, into his city only as himself a citizen of the city, as himself both ruler and ruled within a regime of justice. His vocation is ordered within the tranquility of order as lived by the city. He must speak into the tranquility of order, the peace, as it is instantiated in the particular just social order itself. This is why the virtue of equity is possible in the citizens. This is why the people are capable of judging their prince. This is why custom, if true and not the prince's law, is the highest law of a polity. This needs to be emphasized. Aquinas writes, For if a people are free and able to make their own laws, the consent of the whole people expressed by a custom counts far more in favor of a particular observance than does the authority of the sovereign, who has not the power to frame laws except as representing the people. Wherefore, although each individual cannot make laws, yet the whole people can. The very life of a just people, Thomas explains, is their definitive articulation of properly formed intellects and wills. Their tranquility of order could not possibly be a more definitive law because it is truth specified in actual operation. Thomas states, quote, "It is evident that by human speech, law can be both changed and expounded insofar as it manifests the interior movement and thought of human reason. Wherefore, by actions also, especially if they be repeated so as to make a custom, law can be changed and expounded, and also something can be established which obtains force of law, insofar as by repeated external actions the inward movement of the will and concepts of reason are most effectively declared. For when a thing is done again and again, it seems to proceed from a deliberate judgment of reason. Accordingly, custom has the force of law, abolishes law, and is the interpreter of law. The prince's law has authority only to the extent that it is spoken into the conversation of friends, that is custom, and which is the common good insofar as it is realized in his city and not in another city. It is only in this way that he can lead them deeper into virtue through the fatherly dynamic of authority and obedience. As Thomas states, quote, "For things belong to skills get their efficacy from the power of reason, but laws have no power to persuade subjects that obeying the law is good other than custom, which evolves only over much time," end quote. Custom, to put it simply, is what gives positive law its authority, because it is through custom that it is obeyed. Positive law, as true law, works only in just custom. This does not mean that the prince has no positive law-making office. He does. At the level of the city, new projects must be undertaken, new problems arise and must be overcome, new movements into deeper virtue must be initiated. But these are few in number and extremely general in content and become actual law only by their mediation down and through the various hierarchies of friends that constitute the customary order. As Thomas writes, yet the unity of man is brought about by nature, while the unity of the multitude, which we call peace, must be procured through the efforts of ruling. Therefore, to establish virtuous living in a multitude, three things are necessary. First of all, that the multitude be established in the unity of peace. Second, that the multitude thus united in the bond of peace be directed to acting well. For just as a man can do nothing well unless unity within his members be presupposed, so a multitude of men lacking the unity of peace will be hindered from virtuous action by the fact that it is fighting against itself. In the third place, it is necessary that there be at hand a sufficient supply of the things required for proper living procured by the ruler's efforts. Arguably, the prince's most important function is not positive legislation at all, but reactive defense. He must protect the peace. When Thomas, following Aristotle, talks concretely about the sort of rule exercised by at the civic level, he discusses more than anything else the use of coercion. This is present from the very beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics and Thomas's commentary on it. After articulating succinctly that virtue is the goal of human life and describing how this requires first the domestic grouping and then the civic, Thomas writes that beyond bodily needs to live well, the individual needs the city, quote, also in regard to right conduct, inasmuch as public authority restrains with fear of punishment delinquent young men whom paternal admonition is not able to correct, end quote. You will have noticed that I have spoken very little about the role of coercion so far. The reason is that I just don't think it's that important for an understanding of the nature of politics as such. Its significance, of course, enters in because of the effects of sin. Through sin, the natural inclinations of man toward the true and the good are not destroyed, but rather are distorted. Because of these distortions, every man finds within himself competing practical syllogisms. As St. Paul describes the situation, so I find it to be a law that when I want to do right, evil lies close at hand. For I delight in the law of God in my inmost self, but I see in my members another law, at war with the law of my mind, and making me captive to the law of sin which dwells in my members. Threats of punishment, threats of coercion, therefore, come into play in shifting the relative balance between these two in favor of justice. It reduces the perceived benefit of disordered actions from within the logic of disordered inclinations, indirectly and so relatively strengthening the inclinations towards the truly human course of action, the course guided by right reason and executed through proper affections, creating first dispositions towards virtuous action, which further strengthens proper inclinations. In this way, the threat of punishment can work through sin and so indirectly facilitate the creation of virtue. It also serves the entirely defensive function of protecting this project from the sinful who would prey upon it for their own ends. This function of coercion itself works up and down the hierarchy, from within the tranquility of order and not from outside of it. For example, the first and probably most powerful instance of coercion is a father disciplining his son. But this is all it does. It doesn't create social order. It doesn't itself lead men to virtue. It doesn't create peace. This happens through proper law, truth, and goodness, met with good inclinations, and not through force. Coercion, then, can only be efficacious and just within the structure of the peace itself, and can never be mistaken for some essential aspect of the politics that constitutes that peace. Coercion does not show us where politics is happening. It shows us where the conversation has stopped. It shows us where politics is, tragically, not happening. Nevertheless, punishment in our fallen state is a necessary aspect of law. Grace, however, is far, far more important. Those who are inclined to emphasize coercion or defend a generally more unilateral understanding of law in the process of virtue formation have to contend with the fact that salvation history itself, as interpreted by St. Thomas, seems to be a refutation of this approach. In Thomas's telling, the old law was true, a just specification of the natural law for Israel, and it bore punishments and rewards. But because it was not met with a proper will, because it was not met with the proper inclinations toward the true and the good, it could not in itself finally lead to righteousness, to virtue. Because proper law is not unilaterally rational, but a middle between two rational parties, the supremely just old law was nevertheless experienced as a servile law, a law of fear, a law that took on the form of tyranny from the direction of men, and so couldn't lead to peace. Hence the need for the new law. In Thomas's telling, the new law was in the first instance the grace that assisted internally so that men could be receptive in true obedience to the authoritative instruction that came externally. Thomas's assertion that the new law is both the perfection of law and that it is primarily not law at all, but grace, is not an idiosyncratic or pietistic imprecision, but it rather points to the nature of law itself in the process of perfecting human beings. Through the truth and obedient response that revelation and grace make possible, power was rendered as proper authority and submission as obedience, and so the restoration of politics as efficacious virtue formation occurred. As our Lord himself described this restoration, greater love has no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. No longer do I call you servants, for the servant does not know what his master is doing. But I have called you friends. For all that I have heard from my Father, I have made known to you. The new law, of course, does not merely restore nature. Its healing of nature is an elevation into the supernatural, where it is most fully itself. Grace does not destroy nature, but perfects it. What this means is that we do not have to add the church to our discussion of politics as if coming from without. Rather, the church has always already been in this discussion. The spiritual power of the church penetrates into the essence of all temporal relationships, from that of father and son all the way through to the prince. The teaching and the grace brought through the clergy penetrates into all the complexities of the tranquility of order from the inside, as the clergy, as fully members of the city, have a vocation within its order without a gap. Their vocation is healing the polity, elevating it, and finally making it capable of true peace within the complexity of networks of friends. The priests, whom the people call Father, preach to real people that they know, rendering the gospel in their idiom and bringing people to the sacraments in real rituals experienced in the intimacy of the parish, the spiritual family. The tranquility of the city's order is the tranquility made possible through its membership in the church, a membership that elevates it out of any sort of self-sufficiency that Aristotle supposed possible and into the unity of all mankind, a unity which, as an analogical extension of the unity of the city, fulfills and does not destroy the city's particular instantiation of the tranquility of order. The end of the city's specification of virtue itself becomes the wholly unspecified, unmediated vision of God. In the social hierarchy of peace that I have described, more love flows down than flows up. The father loves his son more than the son loves him. The ruler speaks to the one ruled from a position that is qualitatively and not just quantitatively higher. He condescends. The human hierarchy, therefore, images and mediates the transcendence of God through these smaller transcendences of friendship, and all authority among men becomes an imaging of and participation in the authority of God. As Thomas tells us, the rule of a king, like that of a father, is a divine rule. Thus, the order is essentially gracious and opens upwards, and depends ultimately on the infinite love of God that flows down and through the whole, wherever there is authority and obedience. This love, grace, is what keeps it from collapsing on itself. Aristotle needed slaves in order to sustain a free society. Through the faith, hope, and charity that grace makes possible, however, a total society of true, free citizens becomes possible. Peace with self, which, as we have already seen, becomes in justice the same as peace with neighbor, becomes through grace also peace with God. And every man as a free man can ascend through the peace, through the active life, through its upward openness to contemplation of the divine, and so happiness. In this way, man who is a microcosm as a micropolis is finally and more perfectly seen as a microecclesia. As St. Peter Damian stated, quote, "The whole church forms in some sort but one single person. As she is the same in all, so in each one is she whole and entire. And just as man is called microcosm, so each one of the faithful is, so to say, the church in miniature," end quote. I'd like to conclude with some thoughts on the implications of the priority of peace. It is important to remember that in all of this, I have not been arguing that there ought to be a priority of peace. I've been arguing that in the Thomistic framework, as I understand it, there is a priority of peace. Even our most depraved polities hold together to the extent that they do because of some lingering participation in the tranquility of order. Here, I suppose one ought to revisit Book 19 of St. Augustine's City of God. My point here, though, is that tyranny is parasitical on a deeper peace. It is a violence that preys upon men's lingering goodness and the order that emerges out of it. Propaganda and lying in general, for example, only work because of the deeper trust that underwrites all communication. Theories of sovereignty must therefore be set aside as incoherent. Nothing could make less sense than Bodin's assertion, quote, "The principal mark of sovereign majesty and absolute power is the right to impose laws generally on all subjects regardless of their consent. There are therefore in each case two parties, those that rule on the one hand and those that are ruled on the other," end quote. It is not merely that he is literally describing tyranny, it's that he doesn't understand how tyranny itself works. Tyranny operates through fear, which is always about a good that does not come from the tyrant. The good is the peace. That good is the peace. The tyrant gains his power through threatening the peace, or through manipulating it, or tricking it. The tyrant is a liar more fundamentally than he is a bully. His de facto power exists, of course, not to the extent that he personally hits people, but to the extent that he is obeyed. It is only because man is not fundamentally sorted into two, the rulers and the ruled, that false rulers can emerge as warlords. If we want to talk about politics by talking about the friend-enemy distinction in the mode of Carl Schmitt, we need to put nearly all the emphasis on the friend side, as I've tried to do today. Foucault, among other postmodern theorists, have helped us see that power structures are not unitary, that the one claiming to be the ruler is almost never the actual ruler, and that impersonal, bureaucratic, or administrative mechanisms are only finally powerful through the complex dynamics of hidden hierarchies of violence behind and within them. In order to resist his demonic conclusions, we need not reassert a profoundly modern notion of unitary rulership. We would do much better, I think, to assert the priority of peace, as I believe the medievals understood, and as I've tried to make at least some moves toward here. Practically, we should look to our personal relationships as the place where we most directly participate in politics, and put, I think, most of our efforts at resisting tyranny here. As Thomas states, quote, "There is the least friendship in the worst regimes, namely in tyrannies, in which no friendship or very little exists," end quote. I think I'll end with a quote from Thomas that is very appropriate given our current situation. "For tyrants hold the good in greater suspicion than the wicked, and to them the valor of others is always fraught with danger. So the above-mentioned tyrants strive to prevent those of their subjects who have become virtuous from acquiring valor and high spirits in order that they may not want to cast off their iniquitous domination. They also see to it that there be no friendly relations among these, so that they may not enjoy the benefits resulting from being on good terms with one another. For as long as one has no confidence in the other, no plot will be set up against the tyrant's domination. Therefore, they sow discords among the people, foster any that have arisen, and forbid anything which furthers society and cooperation among men, such as marriages, banquets, and anything of like character through which familiarity and confidence are engendered among men," end quote. So in conclusion, we resist tyrants by talking with each other and having parties. It's my kind of politics.
Awesome. Great. Andrew, thanks so very much.
Sorry.
The schedule is in flux, but as I mentioned, that final panel was a little bit of buffer that we threw in there. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up for Q&A if you're okay for it.
I'm sorry, I didn't.
No, it doesn't matter. Are you okay to take some Q&A?
Sure.
All right, we're going to do that now. Then we'll take a proper break after this, and we'll set up for this state panel and go from there.
Thank you very much, Professor. As someone who works mostly on St. Thomas's use of St. Denis the Areopagite, I'm a big fan of getting hierarchy right, of getting that sacred order and tranquility of order right, so I really appreciate your remarks. I'm wondering, though, if I might push back a little or get you to say something about where the analogy between the Father and the Son and the king and the subject breaks down. Because while it is certainly true that St. Thomas, commenting on Aristotle, in, for example, Book 8 of the Ethics, does talk about a certain proportion between a father and son and a ruler and the political subjects. In that exact same place, after outlining similarities, he also outlines lots of differences. And in Book 1 of the Politics, Aristotle and then Thomas commenting on it, talks about the family coming first and then a village being a different sort of thing that comes forth with families joining together, and then a city being, again, a different thing in kind of many villages coming together, and says that those are not the same sort of communities. They're not ordered to the same sort of good, even though there is an order between them. And then just the last thing I wanted to bring in, and then I'll open it to you to comment also on the differences, is there's also the place in the Secunda Secundae when St. Thomas, I think it's question 50, is talking about the subjective parts of the virtue of prudence, He argues that regnative prudence is a real virtue, is a real species of prudence distinct from political prudence. In other words, the king really has a different virtue than his subjects have. And yet, the father does not have a different virtue than the other members of the family have. There is no species of prudence that is paternal prudence. And that has to do with the way a father relates to his family that's distinctly different from the way for St. Thomas that a ruler relates to the polity. So while I really appreciate setting this analogy back up and getting us thinking about politics in human terms, with the hierarchy having an emphasis there and peace is the foundation of it all, I think that's absolutely essential. I'm worried that by setting it up this way without then focusing on where the analogy limps, as it were, where these things are disanalogous, we end up actually losing politics altogether, and the whole political community becomes one big dysfunctional family, and we end up not having the order proper to the city.
Right.
So I'm just wondering if you could comment on that. In your theory, where does the difference between the Father and the Son fit into, between the Father and the Son and the ruler and the ruled?
The answer, I will give the best I can, okay? But first of all, this room is full of people who are more experts on Thomas than me, all right? So there will be problems, I'm sure. But it is exactly an analogy, all right? So we're not saying it's the same thing, right? So for example, that's where I was trying to make the difference, say, between an architect and a craftsman, right? Where they're working with a different medium. I guess I'll use that word, all right? Towards the common good, right? So the prince then, if we go back to father and son, prince and kingdom, the father is working directly with one person, right? And trying to guide him into virtue. The prince also works directly with one person, his own son. But as a prince, he doesn't do that, right? So as a prince, what he's doing is looking at the whole and trying to understand the whole, just the same sort of way that a father understands the whole of his son, right? So he's trying to understand the whole of the community. That's why I'm saying the custom is like the virtue of the community, if we're doing this analogy, right? The way it is, right? Its inclinations, it could be bad custom, so its inclinations, its virtues, its vices, its way of living. So seeing that, understanding that, and then trying to work in it in order to lead it deeper into itself, into perfection, right? So that's the analogy. But that is not only is it a different scale, you're working with a different thing, right? You're in fact working at a much more abstract level. Now, I will say that one of the things where maybe I differ in style of thought here is that I tend to break things down so that, like for me, the prince, there's no action or power that's not two guys. Okay? So the prince doesn't rule the single peasant. He never talks to him. He doesn't touch him. He only does as mediated all the way down and to where his father says, well, that's not the way we do things here, right? And teaches his son how to do it. There's the human encounter is, even this is true, this is the reason why I resist sort of talks about like coercive authority. And it's like, well, coercion is always one guy hitting another guy, right? Like the interesting thing is the obedience part, right? Like that's the part that stands out. It's like, why is that army doing what that guy says? Not, that's the part that I'm interested in, right? Similar problem, though, is what I'm saying, is that I feel like we can sometimes forget that and start adding layers to things, and as if these collections of people are acting on each other, when they only are sort of, right? Does that make sense?
It sort of does. I guess the one thing I would just continue to think about here is that it does seem to me that in a hierarchy, like again, going back to St. Denis and the angelic hierarchies, it's not just the case, I don't think, in the Christian tradition conceiving of this kind of hierarchical hierarchy of being and so forth, is that you just have one touching the next, touching the next, touching the next, and it's all really ordered sequential individual causation all the way down, but it really is the case that higher causes in the hierarchy are also more universal causes. And
Yeah, but they're mediated through, right?
So mediation is a part of the causality, but that has to do not with limitation, but with generosity, incorporating more into the bringing about of the more universal effect. And sometimes also has to do with limitation in human ways.
Right. But see, that's where what my argument here is that obedience and authority in the hierarchy renders that. It's like, so for example, I teach my child language. This was brought up earlier. I don't create the language, nor do I understand the language, nor do I'm not a linguist. I don't understand the science of language. That's all coming from an order higher than me, right? But I'm still the one who teaches my son language.
My last comment, and I'll walk away from the mic. I just worry that we're going to end up in a politics that's all concerned with what a father is supposed to give to his son, which is the individual virtue of that child in his immediate local setting, as opposed to what I think a prince is responsible for, which is the common good of an entire people.
And here I will, last thing I'll say is that we need to, sometimes it seems that we make distinctions in order to understand better, and that's a good thing to do. But then we sometimes forget that the distinctions were made of a unitary, there was a unity, and we divided it up so to understand the pieces, but they don't actually exist other than in the unity. So often I think when we start dividing up the virtues, there's a virtue. In fact, there's just sort of a virtuous soul. And then we start talking about different ways of that virtue is manifest, and we see it and it's acting in different directions. So I at least resist in my reading of this, treating those things as sort of fixed categories that are not themselves, unified at a fundamental level, right? Okay, that's all I have to say about that.
Hey, Dr. Jones, thank you for your talk. It was excellent. Brought me back to Catholic social teaching. The question that I have, so at the beginning, you mentioned Foucault and Hobbes talking about the notion that some people use power in one area and submit to power in other areas. And then later we have Thomas, who talks about individuals as ruler in some relationships and as ruled in other relationships. And I think you distinguished between those things very well within your talk. But I suppose in a world where liberals are very suspicious of any notion of authority, what are some really succinct or basic things that you would want to bring up to distinguish that for them? Because I think it'd be really easy for them to look at that and say, well, aren't you just using different language to say the same thing, that some people just use power over and against other people?
Yeah, well, I mean,
how do we
the incoherence
approach that dialogue?
You can make an attempt, right, at just saying, and this is what Hobbes does, all there is fundamentally is conflict, right? And Foucault is the same thing, right?
Sure, yeah.
Fundamentally, all there is conflict, and you just have strategies of power, and through acts of submission, because the submitting act itself is just a strategy for power, right? Because you're cutting your losses, right, in the face of a superior, and which is the best you can do in your situation. It's pitiful, but okay. And people start assembling power, and then you get all the sort of power dynamics that go into play there. Okay, you can say that. I think I don't think that you can actually explain what you see without getting into problems. And the reason why is because it's a problem that Hobbes identifies at some point, which is that it's pretty easy to get people to kill for you, but it's really hard to get them to die for you. Yeah, within a total violent scenario, self-interested power scenario, right? And what you actually see when you look at human beings is that we spend most of our human history, it seems to me, looking around for things that are worth dying for, right? And getting people to die for things is actually really easy. Like we have it, it's like what history, they both kill and die a lot. Right? Now that's something that a priority of love or priority of peace, just from a purely sort of historical causal sense, like what's going on here, has a better story for it. right, than the Hobbesians, I think. So that's at least part of it. So I think they have problems with language too. If they want to go with a total, because all language becomes lies, and if all language is lies, it's not language. And why would anyone be tricked into believing it? It doesn't make sense, right? There has to be the trickery into believing it presupposes a assumed realm of coherence and harmony, right? Otherwise, I don't think language even comes into being.
Sure.
So I think they have a problem there.
Okay. Cool.
For whatever that's worth.
No, good.
So I've got a question that I think anticipates a little bit of what Mark Barnes is going to talk about later on in selling off our 401ks.
Don't make me talk about that.
So analyzing that action of emptying out your money, emptying out your power under the framework of obedience from the obedience above and architectonic down,
Right.
Being a mediator of power to those below you.
Right.
My hesitation with doing that is that I feel the charge of responsibility for those below me. And I wonder how can you distinguish between a praiseworthy act of voluntary poverty and the abdication of good authority?
Yeah, well, I mean, what you've hit on is the reason why the church has always affirmed the necessity of, say, private property, right? And I think that if we want to simplify that, we can simplify it as being power, right? Like the ability to fulfill my vocation requires that I control certain material resources so that I can feed and educate my children, say, okay? So that is not just justified, it's obligatory. You have, in your vocation, you need to try to do that, right? Like, so anything that you would do property-wise or something that would inhibit your ability to mediate the peace of society into your family is an unjust thing to do. It's unjust to your children. Right. It's unjust, so, now you can go the other direction where you are unjustly appropriating power, wealth, that ought to be being used elsewhere, right? So that's just justice.
Since I'm not just a father, I'm also a citizen.
Yeah, right. And so there's no reason why you can't perceive, there would be no theoretical reason why you couldn't say, I have a calling to organize production of some good that is beneficial to the society as a whole. I would be really good about this. I understand how to do this. I'm going to go do that. And what that means is I own a bunch of factories, right? Well, that's just what your ownership then is your vocation of serving the common good in that capacity. But that's what it needs to be. Right? It can't be so that you can get rich and go on vacation 9 months out of the year or something.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks for your talk. My name's Robert Wiley. I teach at Ashland University up the road. I teach kind of history of political economy stuff. So cool. I feel like I've been in my element here. It's a lot of fun. I don't know where the rest of you are, or so I think I fear the consequences of breaking the law. I have some experience of that. That's why I think I fear the consequences. A sheriff or two taught me that. I feared my parents growing up, less now, but I had reason for that. I think I fear letting my friends down, so I don't think that friendship excludes fear in a way that your paradigm seemed to set up. And I think I fear the Lord for that reason. I mean, I should fear him more. I'm working on that. I'm working on being a more fearful person in the right ways. I wondered if if one of the things that, I really admire your Before Church and State book. I think that's an amazing book. And I wonder if we lack a Christian understanding of violence, and we lack even an idea that that's a question. So part of the problem, so I work on 17th century stuff, part of the problem is I think we almost have a crypto-positive notion of violence. Like we all think we know what it is because there's a violent car wreck and there's glass everywhere and that's violence. But, the early moderns like to, beat up Moses, Machiavelli, Spinoza for slaughtering the 3,000, rebellion of Korah stuff, and say, see, God is violent. But God can't be violent in that way because and the word's ambiguous, I think, the way St. Thomas uses it, but a violentia is a violation. It's a violation of a divine law oriented towards peace. A lot of your talk reminded me of John Milbank's criticism of ontology of violence stuff. So I've been thinking about this for a long time. So God can't be violent in that way, but it seems he can maybe be violent in another way, right? Violence is a violation of God's law versus just a pure phenomenon. And I think this carries over to how we understand and how appropriate we think state violence, if it is even possible for a just state following God's plan to be violent. The doctor analogy you give is an odd one, right? Because if you think about medieval or classical medicine, it's not laparoscopic surgery, that's bloody business. And but if you know that it's a surgery, which your dog might not know that your veterinarian is performing surgery on your dog, to your dog, that's like it's getting cut open, you don't know why.
Absolutely.
But it's for purposes of health. And I know this makes people very nervous about Christians, of course, because here we come, we all have the metaphysics, we know how to take care of things, so when our cops beat you up, it's fine, because we know what it's for, right? And the early moderns aren't foolish to say, this is horrifying, right? This sort of scholastic political philosophy is horrifying. Think about what it entails. But do we want to think about a Christian understanding of violence, or do we accept a kind of post-secular or even secular understanding of violence, and then whatever sins of omission we do by, not involving ourselves in politics in ways that involve fear and coercion. So that's a comment trying to be a question.
So let me try to respond to it somehow. I purposely didn't use the word violence, I think, at all, except when I was talking about Foucault. Maybe I used it once where it's appropriate. I used coercion or force, and the reason why is because I already talked for an hour and whatever, and I just didn't have time to go into the whole second half, where it would have to be about the questions that you're asking.
You're the guy to do it.
Right? Because for the violence, like you said, I think we should be kind of purists on the use of this word. Like when we say violence, what we need to mean is an unjustified, something that's violent to the nature, something that is hurting the thing, not right, which is different than force. Right? Or coercion. If we're talking about politics, I think there's other uses that maybe are justified. So now the use of force, one of the fascinating things about the Middle Ages, which I really subscribe to, and it maybe doesn't come through in this, is that I don't think force is a really very big deal either direction. Like what I mean is you don't freak out. Like the reason why we have a taboo on force in our society, private force, like someone hits each other in the parking lot over some sort of fight, and we're like, oh my goodness, the police need to come and everyone needs to go to jail, right? The reason why is because we've so monopolized that into the state that a private act of force becomes a political act, right? Like a rival to the state's monopoly on violence, right? And so we've made that taboo. But in an actual sort of subsidiarity-based hierarchical understanding, the use of force within a prudential enforcement of the law at different levels would just be an aspect of what that enforcement of the law was, right? So it wouldn't be shocking when you have, just uses of force in different places, in different locations. So there's no sense in which there's some sort of like a pacifism or something here. That wouldn't be, I don't think that would be the right interpretation, even though if it maybe came across that way, because I was emphasizing peace so much.
Thank you.